Okay, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening for some of you, depending on where you're joining us. Welcome to the IFMBE CED's Leadership Webinar Series on Clinical Engineering Competencies. Today, our topic is partnering with clinicians. I'm Shauna Mulally. I'm a CED collaborator based in Canada. And my co-moderator for this webinar is Paolo Lago, who is a CED board member based in Italy. We are very lucky to have our three speakers today to speak to this topic, Drs. Jeff Cooper, Doug Gray, and Michael McCoy. Next slide, please. So on the agenda today, our three speakers are going to talk to us about their own experiences, share stories, and talk about what leadership with partnering with clinicians looks like for those of us in the clinical engineering profession. They're going to examine this topic from three different levels of the health system, which is really interesting. So Jeff is going to speak to what this actually looks like at the hospital or facility level. Doug is going to speak to what it looks like at a health system-wide level, or for some of you in your countries at a regional level of your health system. And finally, Mike is going to give a government perspective on clinical engineers partnering with clinicians, which for some of you might be at your Ministry of Health level. Next slide, please. Definitions are important, and we know that you've received this package in advance. It's important to note that we use different terminology in different places, but to recognize the work that both the IFMBE Clinical Engineering Division and the WHO and lots of their partners have done in both defining our profession globally and also in raising the profile of our profession and its importance in delivering health services around the world. And it's also important to mention that we always root our work in the guidance and with the leadership of the World Health Organization medical devices team, both in the work that they've done to define priority medical devices around the world and also the work that they've done on our profession and on the human resources for health technology management and clinical engineering. Next slide, please. There are lots of resources. You've gotten these before the webinar today. Some of them are prepared by those of us who are CED collaborators and board members, others through our partner organizations. All of these resources are good readings that really speak to how clinical engineers partner with clinicians to increase patient safety and to make our health services more effective. Next slide, please. So this, I think, is the key message. These are the clinical engineering health technology management leadership principles, and I'd like you to reflect on these as we go through the talk and as we hear what our speakers have to say today. Not only can we clinical engineers be leaders, but I think that we have to be leaders within our healthcare systems, to enable ourselves to do our jobs effectively. These are the leadership principles that really matter when we're working and partnering with clinicians. They're all very important. I will share one brief story. One of the best things I ever heard about leadership was from someone named Dr. Eldred Perry, who's a Welsh physician who started an NGO that I did work for in London and Southern Africa. And Eldred said, no matter what you're doing, start every conversation with an open-ended question. What are you trying to achieve? I think sometimes those of us who focus on the technology tend to think about the technology, and we assume that the clinicians that we work with are thinking about a situation from their clinical point of view. But when we start with that open-ended question of what are you trying to achieve, and two people are keeping an open mind and trying to learn from each other and have mutual trust, that's really where we can make great changes. Next slide, please. So I'm just very going to briefly share a couple of my experiences of partnering with clinicians. The first one is to solve a problem. So I'm sharing a quick story from Yellowknife, where I live, which is in northern Canada and the Northwest Territories. This is a pretty northern place. It's very dark and cold in the winter, and now we have 24-hour daylight. We built a new hospital here in Yellowknife. It opened a year ago, and it was a massive project. It was a new build that replaced the existing hospital, which is the main referral hospital for our whole territory. There were lots of changes, lots of new technologies, and the scope of the project was obviously quite big. But one of the stories I'm just going to share briefly is something that was quite a challenge and required really good communication to fix. So one of the changes that we had is our patient monitoring network at the old hospital was on its own Wi-Fi standalone network. And then we were moving it onto the enterprise or the facility-wide network in the new hospital. And as with big projects, there were some delays with the project, and basically the wireless network didn't get validated when we had hoped that it would, and it left us just a couple of weeks to try and troubleshoot migrating our whole patient monitoring network over onto the existing Wi-Fi network. You can imagine that that was quite challenging, and what ended up happening is in the days leading up to our hospital opening, we had these coverage gaps at the hospital. That was quite a stressful situation for everyone involved. But what I found my role really was, and the role of my team was to take all of the very technical information about the wireless access points and the networking and communication between our monitoring system and the actual wireless network, and talk to clinicians who were very busy running around trying to get their spaces up and running, trying to do drills in their new spaces, to say, this is what this is going to mean for you practically. Can you put clinical workarounds in place? What do we need to do, and which areas should we try and focus on as we're trying to get this working? So for that, I would say communication was the most critical part of problem solving that situation. Next slide, please. And then the second example I'm going to share just very briefly is from work. I was very lucky to do work in Africa for a number of years, primarily based in the Gambia and Zambia. I did a lot of needs assessment work, and I would travel around to hospitals and health centers, often with engineers from the countries I was working in. And there were so many times when we arrived somewhere and the medical director or the hospital administrator just lit up and was so happy to see their engineer showing up to help them solve problems. They would get lots of donations of equipment that couldn't easily be put into service. And then their clinical engineering colleagues would show up and we would have a discussion about, okay, let's set up some training. This is what we're going to need to put this in service. You have extra of this, but the hospital in the next region needs something. So really just focusing on problem solving. And that only comes with trust, trust between clinicians and engineers, that everyone is working together to try and make the system better. So I'm going to hand over now to my co-moderator, Paolo Lago, who's been on the front lines of the COVID response in Northern Italy, and let him share some of his experiences as well.
Thank you, Shauna, and good afternoon from Italy. I am talking from my hospital, the San Matteo Hospital Foundation, where the clinical engineering department is a collaborating center with WHO. We are a center for research and training in clinical engineering and health technology management. So we collaborate with WHO about many projects, for example, the human resources for medical device, the publication about the role of biomedical engineer, and we collaborate with Adriana Velasquez-Berumen and all the team of the WHO. Next slide, please. During this period, we are very involved in the outbreak that interested Europe. The first case in Europe and in Italy was in my hospital on the 21st of February. And we are involved in this outbreak every day. For 3 months, we had meetings with clinicians and nurses, and we plan every day what we have to do in the hospital. We have to prepare for example, new emergency rooms for infectious patients and ICU units for COVID patients. We have to deal with oxygen delivery, tanks, plants, flow meters, masks, ventilators, and so on. And also to reuse technologies. It was very important to have a good inventory and also the clinician collaboration to make the right device in the right place. Also, we have the task to close no COVID activities, so reuse, as to say, nurses and physicians, and to train them on personal protective equipment and so on. So next slide, please. As Shauna said, today we tell 3 stories from 3 different levels: hospital level, the system level, and the government level. Next slide, please. I am very honored to introduce Professor Jeffrey Cooper, a professor of anesthesia in the Harvard Medical School, and he was in a big hospital in Boston, and he had many experience in dealing with biomedical equipment. So Jeffrey, is up to you for your speech.